2018 is our sixth season of excavation at Spike Island, of which 5 have been archaeological field schools where we've had an international group of students, a mix from various countries, including our own from UCC, digging here with us. So this is probably our last excavation here on the island. So the focus of the Spike Island Archaeological Project is the Victorian convict prison that operated here from 1847 to 1883. And over the 5 years, I suppose, early on we were very much guided by the historical record about the prison, but of course the historical record really preserves the perspective of the people who ran the institution. So what we've been focused on is looking at the way in which the prison operated, particularly in terms of its impact on the inmates who were incarcerated here. And the profile of the Victorian prison is really radically different. There was a modern prison here on Spike Island that ran from 1985 to 2004. And even though you can trace a lineage in terms of how those prisons operated between the Victorian era and the modern era, they were very different institutions. So for example, the modern prison that closed in 2004 had maximum of 102 prisoners. Those prisoners lived in cells, 4 per cell. They had televisions and beds and so on, and were, reasonably well treated, proper diet, able to exercise and entertain themselves. And then there was labor involved, but it was voluntary. In the Victorian era, at one stage in the early 1850s, there were up to 2,500 prisoners on this site. Their diet was inadequate. Hard labour was part of the prison regime, and that was forced. So 2 very different regimes. And as I said earlier, the historical documents really give us the perspective of the institution and the people who ran the institution. What's missing from those documents is the voice of the prisoners. And we only have 1 or 2 first-hand accounts of life in the Victorian prison, and even they're atypical. They come primarily from political prisoners. So the first of those would have been John Mitchell, after whom the fort here on Spike Island is now named. And John Mitchell was a gentleman prisoner, so he was treated with kid gloves in comparison to the average prisoner. For example, Mitchell got a room to himself while he was here, whereas some of his contemporaries were in dormitories with up to 40 other individuals, or maybe even 50, depending on the numbers, in the room. So we're at the end of 5 years of excavation, 6 seasons here on Spike Island, and that has produced a huge volume of material that, in a way now, the really difficult part starts, which is pulling all of that material together. Ultimately, for a couple of publications, we've already started the publication process. So in 2016, we brought out a book on the history of the prison here. We have a paper coming out in the Journal of Historical Archaeology comparing really the bodies of the convicts here with individuals from the Kilkenny workhouse, and then comparing those with similar groups of individuals known through their skeletal material from various parts of England. And the whole point of looking at that was that paper, I suppose, tackles Victorian, how would I put it, characterizations or stereotyping of the Irish poor and their bodies. There was a lot of myth-making in the Victorian era about justifying the unjustifiable, whether it's the colonial enterprise in the first place, or also particularly the lack of intervention at the time of the famine. So the Irish were supposed to be violent. There were various myths about their stature tied in with the idea of leprechauns and so on. So in that paper, for example, we showed that they were of similar height to their British cousins. If anything, they were taller because the diet of milk and potatoes pre-famine was healthier than we'll say, what you would have had in a typical British industrial city. And then they were certainly no more likely to incur fractures to their skulls or other bones than their British contemporaries. What was different, though, this is something that we've documented, is that the pattern of injury, if you did get into a fight in Ireland, the pattern of injury was different to what you might encounter, say, in somewhere like Birmingham. So what we have is that the 2 groups are equally vulnerable to encountering some kind of interpersonal violence, but because the pattern of the way of fighting, if you like, was different in Ireland, what we get is a kind of a negative evaluation of that cultural difference. It's ungentlemanly, it's un-British. So this is the kind of thing that we're encountering, but this is our data, if you like, for discussing this is coming from my own specialism, if you like, which is bioarchaeology, where we analyse the skeletal remains of the convicts that we've excavated. And at UCC, we have the only bioarchaeology master's programme on offer in the state. We've been running that since the early 2000s, and in each intake we take about 6 or 7 students, and this Spike Island collection will be part of a research collection going forward for the years ahead. Spike Island is a unique location really because it combines the historic prison in terms of the Victorian prison with its reuse in the modern era from 1985 to 2004 as a prison again. And what's really striking when you work here, and hopefully when you visit here as well, is that the modern prison service really has its origins in a system that was a tool really of a deeply stratified, unjust society. And the function of the Victorian prison service was to keep power in the hands of a small ruling class. And for me personally, one of the most striking results of working here since 2012 is that if we compare the two systems, the parallels are really obvious. And I didn't see that at first. At first I thought, well, here's an unjust Victorian system, and then, the modern system has nothing to do with that. But if we look at the two, we see that there are very striking parallels, and we can draw a direct genealogy between the Victorian system and the modern system. So in terms of the striking parallel, the most striking is the fact that in the Victorian prison, it was the uneducated poor who ended up primarily in prison. And if we look at the modern prison service, we see that it's the most disadvantaged in our society who end up in prison. So whether it's in the Victorian era described by Dickens or the prison that closed in 2004, it's the poor and disadvantaged who end up in prison. And for me, that begs the question, what are we trying to achieve with our modern prison service? And I wonder if in a couple of generations' time, will we look back at the prison system that we're operating now and remember that prison system had its origins in the late 1700s, early 1800s, at the same time that we get the development of the workhouses and the lunatic asylums. And I wonder if we won't look back in a couple of generations and say, will we look at the kind of prison service that we're operating today in the same way that we're looking, say, at the Magdalen laundries or the mother and baby homes, all of which grew out of that trio of services that I mentioned, the prisons, the workhouses and the lunatic asylums.